Ardwick. That's where he was born. In 1916. If he's alive, he'd be 100 years in this December. So you come at the right time. We celebrate his 100. I'm so pleased.
His work is so imbued in the British psyche that it's almost impossible to pinpoint one specific thing that would characterize his work, why it's important. Everyone who grew up in the 60s or the 50s or the 70s knows his work.
And if you just look at his back catalogue, the posters that he was responsible for, he is responsible for some of the most iconic poster images of 20th century cinema poster art.
He was resolutely unpretentious. He was one of the most down-to-earth blokes you'd ever meet. He had a sly sense of humour, very dry, very northern, very Mancunian.
We lived in a big house in Croydon. He had twin daughters, and my mother was Chinese, and Singaporean Chinese. So it was an unusual community because it was very cosmopolitan in where we lived.
1966, we bought a house. 68, I suddenly expecting. But it turned out to be undiagnosed twins. And I remember when they were born in King's College Hospital. 6 o'clock they were born in the morning. I must have rang him about 9 o'clock. I said, we got two. I said, two what? I said, 2 girls. No, you must be kidding. Tom couldn't contain himself. They have to actually offer him whiskey or brandy to calm him down.
Tom left school at 15, had clear artistic ability, went straight to a local Manchester art agency, advertised an agency called Rydales, was taken on immediately, told to start on Monday. Within about a year of working at Rydales, the top illustrator there left and formed his own little agency, and Tom was taken as one of the company's best illustrators. At this point, he's still only 16, he's incredibly young. He's with the new firm for about a year, and then it gets a bit unfortunate. He's a young lad, he's only 16, he's got a temper on him. The version I got from Tom was that there was an argument in the studio. There had been a very poor quality piece of work done, which was wrongly attributed by the studio manager to Tom. It was actually somebody else's work. But for some reason, the manager didn't believe him. There was a very heated argument that degenerated into a full-scale punch-up. They were literally like throwing each other around the studio, paint pots flying everywhere, sacked on the spot. So at that point, he moves down to London. This is 1933. He's still only just coming up to his 17th birthday. Lives with his sister Phyllis in Hampstead initially, and manages to immediately talk himself into a job with a silkscreen printer. Silkscreen is an old method of printing posters. It's still used today, although it's much more sophisticated now than it was then.
Well, I first came to Tom Chantrell, and I didn't realise that Tom was a Mancunian, and in fact it was Chantrell, and family and friends used to refer to him as Chan. I think when I started off as a poster dealer, I felt that Chantrell probably implied something quite exotic and foreign, and it was a useful selling tool, but actually it was plain and simple Chan.
Because I remember when I met him, and he said, my name is Chan. I said, oh, you got a Chinese dad? No. My name is Chantrell, and in the studio, I'm the boss, and nobody wanted to call me Mr. Chantrell, so they shortened my name, just call me Chan.
Tom was a talented artist, a natural artist. When he first went to work, he wasn't producing cinema posters. He was working on architectural and technical designs. So he was contributing artwork to technical publications. I mean, he did the odd poster, but to begin with, he was a technical drawer or technical illustrator.
He was doing propaganda and artwork for the military. Of course, we have no record of any of this artwork. He'd already started doing his first film poster, I think it was 1938. He wasn't the scruffy boho artist of the 60s and 70s. I mean, he was a man of his era. He was in the Second World War, he was in bomb disposal, so he was very smartly dressed. So he'd go into the bathroom, he'd come out with a very smart pair of slacks, proper shoes, and a proper shirt, and a jacket, So it was almost like suited and booted, it was just, and he would be sitting there, very smartly dressed, painting away, with his shirt sleeves rolled up. And he never changed. That was what he dressed like all the time.
It was really after the war that he began to get involved more with cinema posters. And that certainly during the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was his staple. Now he did also occasionally design book covers, LP covers as well. Most of those were related. They had a film connection, but he wasn't simply designing film posters.
Our house was just literally covered in posters. We had posters. He said the easiest way to store them was to put them on the wall. So our house was like a museum. I mean, people would walk in and be quite shocked at how many posters were on the wall.
Tom was important for several different reasons. He had a very long, intensively busy career. He was doing these things virtually continually for 40 years straight, without any distraction. So he was very experienced. He developed a winning formula and refined it as time went on, so it just got better and better and better. As an artist, he was very skillful. I think he was just intuitively, naturally talented anyway. I mean, he was drawing incredible stuff when he was still at school. He was able to, again, refine his skills on the job as he went.
Tom had a unique ability to synthesize different elements together. So he would take wonderful portraiture and also combine this with the graphic qualities required for the movie title, the credits, everything that had to go onto the film poster. But he also had a really special ability to capture the spirit of that movie and portray that in an exciting way.
Again, one of the things which is really interesting about Chan is that you've got a film title. A lot of artists, the important thing was the poster design and you stick the title on somewhere. Chan frequently would create a poster where the film title was absolutely integral. It was part of the design. It was part of the artwork. So, for instance, She is a very good example of that. The Brigand of Kandahar, a Hammer film, is another very good example of that. And then the taglines, as we've discussed. You want a funny tagline, you want a slightly tongue-in-cheek, you want a double entendre. Well, yeah, he was the man. So he did a lot. An awful lot of work was invested into creating those posters.
I also think more than that, there's something very special about Tom's work. If you think about images that define a moment or a decade, and you could, for instance, pick Lewis Morley's extraordinary shot of Christine Keeler sitting astride the chair, which is really one of the seminal images of the 1960s. Tom did something slightly different. Over several decades, he actually almost helped to create the sensibility of those decades. Yes, he also captured some of the sensibility, but if you think about how imbued his images are in cinematography, in the film psyche, in the film world, in the British psyche, whether it's Brighton Rock or A Million Years BC or even his extraordinary Star Wars poster, you can't really imagine those decades without his work.
He would be at home and he would have classical music. I don't think he could really work around us. So he was very much a night owl, and we'd wake up in the middle of the night, Dad'd still be there in the darkness with some classical music playing, with a single lamp over him in the darkness, just painting away, and then rushing to work and rushing to get it delivered the next morning. But I think he needed the pressure to be inspired as well, so that was half the thing. I don't think anyone does anything. I think I work very much like that now myself. I have to be under pressure.
And sometimes my dad, let's say to give my mum a break, would take us up to London with him to drop off film posters, etc., around Soho and Compton Street. My mum would sometimes come with us as well. The Chinatown was close by, and it was, very bubbling, very different to how it is now.
Tom had an innate understanding of how to put bums on seats. This is what we're talking about. A poster that pulls people in off the street.
There was one famous actress who said, if only Tom had painted me, I would be more famous than I am now. I mean, literally, if my dad painted somebody, he could, Raquel Welch, if you think about 1 million years BC, Raquel Welch is not the leading star in it. There's I don't remember the name of the guy that's in it, but if you actually see the movie, she's actually only got a small part in it. She only comes in halfway through the movie, and yet she's the only dominant figure. And I think it was my father's idea just to have her and not to include the other characters in it, because he said, this will sell it.
Tom was had a particular affinity for the female form. And so whether Marilyn Monroe in Bus Stop, or Sophia Loren in The Millionaires, or Ursula Andress in She, or Raquel Welch in 1 Million Years BC, these are all fantastic depictions of very sexy women.
I do have a thing for the females in the post. I just think he made them look so good, so sexy. He really captured that screen goddess. Imagery.
One of the reasons that so much of his artwork from the 40s and the 50s, very early 60s, has been lost is because he didn't really hold it in any great regard.
When he used to finish a piece of artwork, he used to just chop it up or put it in the bin. And it was my mother that stopped him. She said, "What the hell are you doing with this artwork? It's so amazing." And he said, "Well, if you want to collect it, you can have it." So my mum is the one who's collected all these amazing posters that we see today. She's the one that's treasured them and kept everything that he's ever done, and valued it. And I think after that, my dad started valuing his artwork a lot more. She even photographed my dad painting these Star Wars posters. There's an image of him holding it up, because she just knew there was something really special about that piece of artwork.
Tom, for most of his career, worked for an advertising agency, originally a design studio. The design studio was called Bateman Artists, which was later bought out by the agency who fed it most of its work, Allardyce Palmer. So he worked office hours. He would be at his desk for about 9 o'clock and would work through till about tea time.
He didn't like outside interference. That's one of the reasons why he went freelance. His MO was quite particular. He would go to work, but he'd be very happy to talk to colleagues and others about philosophy, about religion, about politics, about psychology. And he would then end up going home and working at home. And he would work with classical music on in the background and a glass of whiskey. And a lot of his work, a lot of his best work, came from that environment. It wasn't conventional. Chan was not a conventional man.
For Dad, it was a job, and I think Dad wanted to be in Soho because it was more interesting, it was more fun, he could design and paint. And in the early days, of course, he would come up with the full design. You didn't have a middleman and say, oh, well, we should have it like this, we should have it like that. We need a sexy girl over here, we need a landscape, we need a fight scene over here, an explosion here. He'd come up with the whole design. So, so the whole layout was down to him.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about Chan is that he he often got involved in series of films at their beginning or during their heyday. So when Elvis was breaking, Chan was responsible for several of the early Elvis Presley film posters. In the early 60s, when the Carry On films were fantastically popular in Britain, from 1963 to 66, there were a series of 5-6 carry-ons that Chan did in a series. And these, surprise, surprise, what are the most collectible carry-on film posters? Well, they're the ones that Chan was responsible for.
It was probably at least partially a publicity stunt. It was covered in the national press quite heavily as a novelty story. There is no such thing as bad publicity for films. Everybody involved probably did quite well out of it. Background's interesting. Allardyce Palmer, the agency that Tom worked for, had two big film accounts that we've talked about, Fox and Warner Brothers. 1964, Fox made what at that point was just about the most expensive film that had ever been produced anywhere, Cleopatra, with Richard Burton, Liz Taylor and Rex Harrison. Carry On producer Peter Rogers was always on the lookout for topical novelties that could be turned into carry-on comedies. Very fast turnaround on them, obviously, like what's topical 1 year will not be topical in 6 months' time. So Cleopatra was a golden opportunity for Rogers. Firstly, everybody was talking about it, this massive Hollywood blockbuster. Secondly, at Pinewood, which was the studio the Carry-Ons were shot at, the backlot was covered with massive, incredibly expensive Egyptian sets, and there was a whole load of Egyptian costumes that had been set up in wardrobe. So we had free access at Pinewood to all of these different resources.
The poster was a depiction of the Carry On crew, Amanda Barry reclining on a divan, and it was a complete mimic of the original film Cleopatra, made in 1963.
The point about the Cleopatra poster, the original one, was it was a bit of a hodgepodge anyway. The original version, which is by an American artist called Howard Turtling, showed Richard Burton leaning over a divan on which Liz Taylor is languorously reclined. The third star, Rex Harrison, plays Caesar, objected to this poster because he wasn't on it. And he had contractual billing. He was third billed, and he was entitled, under the terms of his contract, to be featured equally prominently on the poster. They didn't want to do a new one from scratch, so Turtling was asked to add Rex Harrison's portrait on the left of the original design. It depends what you believe with this story, really. It is possible to imagine Fox are already smarting from having lost an absolute fortune on this epic, and seeing a very cheap spoof, take the mickey out of their failure, as it was.
And the film poster, they said my dad had copied the American film poster, so it was all taken to court.
The defence was led by Lord Hailsham, and he kind of played it as a joke, really. He had been told about the rather silly history of the original Fox poster, and was able to play that up and point out that the Carry On poster was spoofing a poster that was pretty stupid in the first place, and it was rather unreasonably restrictive to try and ban a poster just because it was an entirely accurate Mickey take of something that was lacking in any credibility to start with.
And Chan ended up in court defending his poster design, and his defence was that this was not a copy, not plagiarism, but was a parody. It was clearly a Mickey take. Having said that, the court case went against them. Chan's great illustrated poster of Amanda Barry reclining on the divan, taking the Mickey out of Cleopatra, that got ditched.
It basically conjured up so much press and excitement that people actually went to the movies to compare both movies and to compare each poster.
The agency had to come up with a new design very, very quickly. Ray Youngs was given the job of coming up with something else, and apparently virtually overnight did the second Carry On Cleo poster, which is an equally effective but much more basic and crude piece of work.
I mean, the piece that we sold was his original artwork for Cleopatra. That was bought back in 2012 for just shy of £10,000, which for a piece of British cinema poster artwork was pretty good.
Tom always maintained it was basically a fit-up that was devised between Warner's and Fox for a lot of free publicity that would get national press attention, which it did. So the story ultimately didn't do anybody any harm. Helped the carry-ons, and it helped the original Cleopatra.
Same thing with Hammer. Chan became pretty much the in-house poster designer and illustrator for Hammer from 1965-66 through to 1970. He also, quite interestingly, in the early 70s, was responsible not only for illustrating Hammer posters, but Hammer used Chan to produce artwork that was used in their financial pitches to try and secure funding for their movies.
The guys from Hammer could literally go to the people that were sponsoring the movie and say, oh, we've got this movie idea, and they would show them the poster, and they would think that the movie was halfway through being made. They didn't even have a script for it.
Very interesting. I don't know of any other artist who was used in that way.
Probably one of the best Hammer stories is that they had an idea for a movie called Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. In fact, the V&A have got this poster, the original poster, and all the layouts and everything to it. They said it's going to be a Dracula movie, and we're going to have Christopher Lee in it. And my dad didn't even have a photograph. Literally, I think he had a photograph of Christopher Lee looking deadpan like that. Not very scary for for a vampire movie. So my dad posed, and we have a photograph of my dad doing with an uplight underneath him, like, doing the whole vampire Chanterelle thing, And he painted himself in the poster, and then painted all the images underneath in the layout. And they agreed on the poster, and he says, well, I need a picture of Christopher Lee doing this, I need to repaint it. And they said, oh no, don't worry, but nobody will know it's you, Tom. Do you know what I mean? And to this day, people, if you see the original artwork, it's my father, but everyone thinks it's Christopher Lee.
Things always happen unexpectedly. And then we went and picked up the children, the twins. He said, oh, I need you running with a little boy. Where do you find a little boy? We don't know a little boy. So he said, let's go to that park near Hodderman Museum. And then he went up, approached a lady with this little boy just leaving school. And the lady agreed. So I was running with a little boy. I didn't know what it was for. But then, that was the poster. Me running with Jenny Agutter. Walkabout, a beautiful film. Love this film. Lots of friends I know love this film. Must go and see it.
In terms of the range of techniques, this is again one of the things that marks him out as something a little bit special. Now, in the 40s and 50s, most poster artists were creating, or cinema poster artists were creating posters that were literal. They looked not photorealist, but they looked fairly conventional. Chan could do that. I think what he did at that time was he nonetheless invested a lot of colour, a sense of vibrancy and movement in those posters. Posters from that era, quite often figures have an outline, a black outline around them. That was one of the techniques that he used. But he was an incredibly versatile poster artist. So although he could do posters in that style, he could do, the Star Wars is a continuation of that type.
Well, with Star Wars, first of all, the thing about Star Wars at the time, there was Star Trek. Star Trek was this very kitsch, almost 60s kind of sci-fi program that was on. You know, everyone was falling in love. There was, there wasn't a lot of action. There was a lot of thoughtfulness. And suddenly my dad says, "Oh, we've got to go and see a movie. It's for work." And there I am, kicking and screaming, going, I really don't want to see a sci-fi movie at 11. This is going to be really, really boring.
Before the work started, we had to go and see the film first. We had invitation to go and see the film.
It was apparent to 20th Century Fox that Star Wars was going to be a big film. It wasn't particularly expensive, ironically. The budget was only about $9 million, which wasn't a huge amount for Hollywood at that point. But, as we all know, Star Wars works. And Fox rapidly realised they had got a potential blockbuster on their hands. The British release was set for December 1977. And initially, an American design was used on the British poster. The first British poster for Star Wars was by a couple of American artists, brothers, called the Hildebrandt Brothers.
The original poster design, which was American, was it's a good poster, but it's quite ethereal. It doesn't really communicate to you anything at all about the characters or the personalities. It really promotes a genre. A sort of vague sci-fi futuristic genre. It doesn't really get to the guts of the film.
20th Century Fox called and said, "We got 2 tickets for you to go and see Star Wars because then you can do the poster." And then he said, 2? It's not enough. We want 4 tickets. 4 tickets, I'm not sure you can get it. And then the post came. 4 tickets! Wow!
And get to the Dominion Theatre, where they're putting a screening on, a very large screening for all the people working on the film, for the British film, and they're going to get Dad to paint the poster. Absolutely in there, completely never seen anything like it, completely awestruck, crying at the end, and just hooked on sci-fi straight after that. Have never seen anything like that before.
It was felt by George Lucas and Gary Kurtz, the 2 producer partners who made the film, that they wanted a new angle to launch the film in Britain. Lucas in particular felt that Star Wars was a human story.
And he wanted a poster where the personalities of the actors came through.
I mean, lots of people were involved in the Star Wars publicity campaign. The reason Tom was involved was that he had worked for the agency Allardyce Palmer, who'd held the Fox account right from 1936, so he was known for decades for turning out really good posters for 20th Century Fox. So his name was clearly in the frame, and he and various other people were brought in.
It took Tom a whole month to do that film poster, and that's a long time. Normally he doesn't take that long.
I remember him having to airbrush the whole black and getting the spattering for the stars, and Mum posing in the back garden, and all the stills being around. There was loads of stills of all the sort of posters, but hey, this is another job. My dad was doing millions of jobs that you kind of peer over, was interesting, and then, okay, that's another job, and just leaving him to get on with it.
I had this funny feeling I have to capture it. So I said, hold it up. Next morning, hold it up. I said, let me take the pictures. Before he even finished the artwork, look. And I'm so pleased I did it. Life is strange.
With something like that original Star Wars poster, it was a very fresh looking poster, and obviously the haircuts, the costumes, the styling is very much of its time, but it somehow managed to transcend that and go beyond that.
The first initial impact of Star Wars was image-based rather than actually a filmic way. The image set a precedent for what then came afterwards, so that's what's incredibly important about it, because it's sort of defined the beginning of a new culture, and a culture that is one of the most influential cultures in modern, image-based history from, again, from everything that it created, from the films itself and what those have then, the continuation of that legacy through to merchandise, etc.
Chan's imagery is truly iconic because it has been used for the marketing of that franchise. That image crops up time and time again.
And then I remember being at school and just seeing my dad's poster on every rubber pencil case. This is the first time there was a movie that literally had generated, that they used this artwork, and it was on everything. I mean, cups, everything. And I remember telling people, that's my dad's poster, that's my dad's poster. And it's brilliant to see the new movies have come out again. And, I've got a cup mug here with my dad's poster on it. I mean, I went to Tesco's the other day and picked up a bag with my dad's poster on it. And, I personally believe that this is probably the most iconic poster of to date.
There was something incredibly new about it in the way that everything came across, from obviously the film itself, but everything that surrounded the film, from its design through to its merchandise to language, everything.
And actually saying to people, my dad painted that poster or designed that poster, and kids going, yeah, go on, get away with you. That's, it's done in America, and that's what people actually thought. It wasn't done here in Britain, but, it's a middle class family.
So I didn't know that it was a British film poster artist, but it makes sense, and it makes sense to obviously where the film was made and what was happening at the time. There was a lot of great British illustrators doing films, people like Philip Castle, who did Kubrick stuff, based in London. And I think, it's probably, maybe it was a bit of a change of the guard from, before that it was people like Sol Bass, who were sort of the most in-demand illustrators at the time from America, from California. But I didn't realise it was British, the illustrator.
So the unusual thing with my dad doing the Star Wars poster was that he had to paint it twice. So he was commissioned to do it for the UK, and as I said, George Lucas liked the poster so much, they recommissioned it and re-released it in America. And it just blew up in America. I mean, you can see old footage of queues around the block wanting to see this movie.
Just like Tom's work for Star Wars, I look at that poster and I go, that is Star Wars. And I don't think any of the other posters do that. I think that's perfect packaging.
Obviously we're English and we're familiar with that. I remember that poster out of all the other posters that have come since. That one, for some reason, stands out.
The account executive for Allardyce, who ran the Fox account, was John Fairburn. He set up a meeting with Gary Kurtz, where Kurtz was going to be viewing all of the art. And this was quite a lot of art, apparently, 15 or 20 different pieces, different design concepts. They were all lined up in the office. The version I was always told was Gary Kurtz walked in, glanced around, 15 seconds, that one, thanks, goodbye. And that was it. That was all it took to pick out Tom's work, because I think it would clearly have been not just the best piece of work available, but it clearly did exactly what the producers were looking for in the most dramatic, colourful, eye-catching way imaginable.
It's a strong piece of graphic design because of the way the characters are in the V formation. We still do that on shoots, create that depth. And I think it has an almost three-dimensional feel, with Luke right at the front, almost jumping out of the poster. And with photography, it's all about the front, the middle, and the back. And I think if you decoded that poster, you would start to see that. And I think that's powerful because of it. And I like, as I was saying earlier, the composition, although it's busy, there is graphic space on it. He doesn't put it straight in the middle. He puts it over to the left on the quad. And the typography is respectfully on a grid to the right.
For that particular poster, I think you've got almost a photorealist type creation in the sense that the characters are all immediately identifiable. You know, these aren't vague approximations of Harrison Ford, etc. You know, he's got them down to a T. But there's also a great sense of movement and vitality and action and colour. And these are essential, or were essential, ingredients in the film. And he was able to translate that through his poster illustration.
One of the things about Tom, which John Chapman and Ray Youngs and Tom Barbet, everybody associated with him would say he always wanted a reference. What Tom wouldn't do, and what any good designer wouldn't do, is they wouldn't just invent something, because it never works.
Well, my mother was the most obvious one, the most unusual one. My mum is Princess Leia.
When Tom get a commission for any film work, he always get the 10x8 black and white still. So he showed me the still. He said, I want you to dress like that and pose for me. So I said, oh yes, of course. That dress, you had it made specially for me, made to measure. And that's got the similar sleeve, only not as long. And yeah, I need all the fold, yes, all the fold. You must put the fold in. And so I put this dress on and pose for him so that he can create that poster, the Star Wars poster. Because all the photograph hasn't got that position, so he had to make ones for himself to create that poster.
A lesser artist might have thought, I'll just guess what it looked like and make it up. That wouldn't work. It would look sloppy, it wouldn't look believable. The reason that Star Wars and all of Tom's posters work is that he insisted on a reference. Everything is taken from life. That's what makes it look realistic. Uniquely, with Star Wars, Tom sold the actual art. This was, I think, probably the only time this ever actually happened in his career before he retired. The arrangement normally, although there is some controversy here, is that when an artist paints a piece of commercial art, they own the physical painting. They are leasing the image to the person who's commissioned it, the client. And the client can do what they like with the image, usually, although it's quite tightly defined in the contract. Normally, it'll be, this is a film poster that will be used to advertise a film, and that's it.
I don't think anyone at the time could have imagined quite what a phenomenon Star Wars would have become, because had he and the family retained that jewel in the crown, it would be worth quite a bit now.
With Star Wars, Fox, or I think more specifically George Lucas, liked the design so much. Through Fox, he negotiated with Tom direct to buy the artwork outright, which was quite unprecedented. Tom told me he had to sign all kinds of documentation, and he had to send them samples of his, because the artwork is signed. He habitually signed most of his artworks, including Star Wars. He had to send them various samples of his signatures and match up. There was a lot of legal shenanigans went on, but in the end, he physically sold Fox the actual Star Wars painting. They didn't name a price. It was left to him to pluck something virtually out of thin air. So he decided to ask for, I think, £2,000, which at that point was, for him, quite a lot of money. It was approaching 7 or 8 times what he would have got paid for a standard film poster. So he thought it was probably a good deal. Otherwise, all he would have ended up with was a painting that would have been stored in his attic. Fox bought that artwork because they wanted the copyright for every kind of commercial use in perpetuity, which is why it is now so incredibly famous, because it has been used again and again and again on everything.
Well, maybe he didn't sell it, it wouldn't be that popular, would it? So you can't sort of judge this sort of thing. What happened is happened. For the good.
So there's a kind of an irony there. It's the only bit of artwork that Tom didn't retain, and the fact that he didn't retain it is what made it so universally, internationally prevalent.
So they offered him, I think it was between £1,200 or £1,500 for the copyright, and I believe it was also offered either that or a percentage of the merchandise, which I think was about 3%, which to my calculations could be worth about £20 million today.
No, I really don't know. It could have been an awful lot of money. I would have had a very different life, I think.
And I think if that piece of artwork, just the artwork, came onto the market again and was sold without copyright, just as a piece of artwork, it's my guess that that would be selling for £500,000, possibly £750,000.
It would be nice to feel that if it was being auctioned somewhere that it was going to be, you could see it and it was there for the world to share and be inspired by.
In those days, you would literally choose a film by the poster. We didn't have you couldn't check online to see what movie you wanted to see or see a preview or something like that. So you would literally go up to town and you would look at a movie theatre and just see these posters. And when my dad did the poster for Come Play With Me, it ended up becoming the longest running porn film in Soho. So, and I don't think it was anything to do with the quality of the movie. It's pretty dire, to be quite honest. I've seen it, the clips of it.
But Tom actually quite enjoyed boundary pushing. During the 70s, when a lot of his work was freelance, Tom was working mostly for independent distributors, and their movies were mostly exploitation fare. So sex comedies, kung fu films, not great films, but great fun to illustrate and advertise. And Tom enjoyed doing that work.
I think Tom's abilities were extraordinary. He really could he had this unique gift to capture the spirit of a movie. I think that's absolutely right. He also had a wonderful graphic sense. He would often use heightened perspective, low camera angles or high camera angles, and exaggerate in order to draw the viewer in and have that excitement. That's something that we very much did with a project of ours called Manga Dreams, which was about capturing the spirit of Asian youth and the influence of Japanese comics on youth culture worldwide. And for that we did use a lot of exaggerated poses of fighters and boxers and heightened perspective. And maybe it's because of that project, it is because of that project that Lucasfilm approached us and commissioned us to do work for Star Wars 7 for the movie poster and the merchandising. And there's a nice circularity with that in Tom's work. It's just a wonderful tradition to be a part of.
There was that whole thing, if we had a friend or someone come home, we went, if I mention it or pull out a card, they go, your dad did the Star Wars poster, that is, you do get that reaction. But, that's what my dad did. He did amazing film posters.
I remember as a child in bookshops seeing the Dennis Gifford Book of Horror Movies with that green cover with Frankenstein and Dracula on the front, and I think it's got King Kong and Godzilla on the back. Godzilla's eating a train, if memory serves correctly. And, as a child, I was fascinated and slightly terrified by this. And then when we were down at Tom's house one day, he was rummaging in among the artwork and he pulled out this board. And on this board was the original artwork for this book cover. And it was like an electric shock going through me. I just couldn't believe it. The effect it had on me was so profound and took me right back to being 7 years old and fascinated and scared and just overwhelmed by these images. Tom had that gift. He really had that gift to capture and portray something that moves people.
I had people tell me that posters weren't artwork at one point, and then they saw. Years later, one of my friends said, "Oh, posters aren't artwork." I said, "My dad was an artist. Oh, that's not considered art." And then they saw my dad's artwork and they went, "I take my hat off. That's real art."
Generally speaking, the posters that draw people in and people are most excited by are Chan's posters. And what's really interesting for me is that it's people it's teenagers, it's 20-year-olds, it's a younger generation who are drawn to this stuff and drawn to Chan's work in particular. And that's something I find very encouraging.
I think Tom truly is an artist. He had a very specific niche and a very specific brief that he always had to fulfill for these works. But the fact that everyone knows that poster from A Million Years BC, or from Star Wars, or from Brighton Rock, with the classic film noir look, the fact that these are so well known is something that would not be true if he were merely fulfilling the brief. And I think his work is very under-recognised in that regard.
And then, of course, towards the end of his career, he faced the problem that all poster artists at that time faced, which was that the market changed over a period of 18 months.
And then from the early 1990s, you've got computers coming in. You can design a poster on computer for a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time it would take to pay an artist to paint one. So British cinema, it didn't finish, obviously it continued, but the kind of commercial backing that had been there, the government support and funding for British cinema ended in 1985. The audience was rapidly shifting around. That was it, end of film posters, or end of painted film posters.
Because of Photoshop, I think was a big revolution for graphic designers. I think when that came in the 90s, that allowed us to be flexible and actually use photography more.
Obviously, technique, the way something is created is different. Back then, it was an analog approach, paint, drawing. Today, it's digital. I'd say the challenges are the same. The objectives are the same. It's basically film marketing, but the way it was, the journey to that was different, very different.
There was a revolution in lithographic printing, and I think that's when photography came in and they were able to show photography or print photography in a very realistic way. That was a kind of revolution. And I think generally the people's awareness of design and aesthetic has come on leaps and bounds, even since, I was training in the 90s. But equally, the painted and illustrated looks is, it's not an easy thing to achieve, but it is very much of its time or a genre.
We also have, over recent years, had a piece of artwork accepted by the Victoria and Albert Museum. So Chan is one of the few British cinema poster artists who has a piece of artwork in their archive. Again, that is a sign of the repute and the standing that he has, that the V&A were interested in taking a piece of his artwork.
What is my favourite poster? Well, I think I've actually got most of my dad's favourite posters with me. As you can see, they're not really posters that people would know about, but I think they're just absolutely beautiful. I mean, you can just keep looking at them and you just get drawn into them. Beautiful faces, beautiful portraits capturing detail, shadow, light, every hair on people. It's fantastic. I mean, some of them you can actually see my father in them. You can actually see my father leaning over and poses at my father. I can see my father's hands in them, so actually drawings of his own hands. So yeah, and probably me as well.
My dad was an incredible artist. I mean, to me, that was his job.
How I'd like my father to be remembered. I'd like him to become a recognised artist.
I'd like him to be remembered as one of the greatest poster artists of all time.
To put Chan on the map, to actually celebrate his work, his life, his career, and to broaden the appeal of his posters and his poster designs.
Yeah, he was a great man.